Okay, so good afternoon everybody, and welcome to lecture 12 of the Politics of Religion. And today I'm going to be focusing on the topic of gender and sexuality. Obviously, this is a really important topic. One of those topics where I don't even think I need to stand here and tell you why it's an important topic. It's just obvious, right? We're talking about things, access to reproductive healthcare, freedoms around sexual orientation, LGBTQ issues, the role of women in society, patriarchal attitudes, and so on, right? So all of that stuff. Interesting gender divide in this room as well. I think it's my first observation of today, but I'm not saying anything. So this is the plan. First of all, I'm going to start off by talking about the genders. People are looking around now. It just looks to me like there's a sort of, what would it be, like 85% of one particular gender. Anyway, first of all, I'm going to start off by talking about the gendered nature of religion, in addition to the gendered nature of this lecture. Then I'm going to move on to talk about attitudes towards gender equality. Thirdly, I'm going to be looking at religious attitudes towards sexual minorities. And then finally, I thought I'd do this thing. I don't want to sort of do this every week because it gets a bit boring. But in the start of the module, we go through these three main theoretical approaches, right? So we've got terror management theory, the religious markets approach, and social control theory. And so what I thought I'd do today is just kind of end the lecture by explaining how these different theoretical lenses can be used to explain some of the stuff that I'm going to be going through over the next 43 minutes. So, the first issue here then is the gendered nature of religion. And I think this is something that I might have mentioned before, but I think it's a sort of mildly interesting factoid, which is that women tend to be more religious than men. Now, this is something that's been found in numerous studies, all parts of the world, different times, and as you can see here, right, it's described by Vardy et al. As being one of the most widely cited findings in the study of religion. Now, it's true that the differences involved aren't huge, right? It's not like women are 20% more likely to be religious than men. It's a matter of small percentages, but they're there and they're noticeable and they show up again and again, and it's the kind of thing that you can't just sort of ignore, right? So if it comes up with this sort of regularity, then it needs to be explained. For example, there are a few places where this doesn't work, so I'm kind of talking about a general globally average picture, right? The data shows that women, for example, have more interest in religion than men. Women are more likely to say that religion is more important to them. Women will pray more often than men, and although this is one where it doesn't always work, it depends on the context, women attend religious services more frequently than men. And the reason why there's a slight caveat there, for example, is that there are some societies and some versions of religion where being seen to be at a place of worship, being seen to be praying is part of the social expectation, and that tends to apply more to men in particular cases. But as a general average, that's the pattern, right? So here is some research by Pew. There's quite a bit of stuff from Pew in this lecture, by the way, because they have done a lot of research on this topic, and this is showing you the global picture in the gender difference between different religions, and also, as you can see at the bottom, non-religion. And the overall figure, which is not shown here, by the way, is that 83% of women globally will report being affiliated to a religion, whereas the figure for men is 80%. So the global average is there's a gap of 3 percentage points. But as you can see here, if you look at particular religions, for example, 52% of Jews are women, 54% of Buddhists are women, 53% of Christians are women. The only religious categories where men score higher than women are in Hinduism, folk religions, And interestingly, because all the stuff we talked about in an earlier week, right? The idea of new atheism and the various problems around that, the religiously unaffiliated, where 55% of which are men. So that's the overall gap in a sort of globally average viewpoint. This is showing you some data at the country level around the world. And what this is showing you, the countries that are listed in orange are countries where women have a higher level of religiosity than men by 2 or more percentage points. Okay, so if women score 82%, men score 80%, that country flashes up as orange. And there are 2 interesting findings to come out of this, right? One is that women are 2 or more points higher than men in around about a third of all the countries in the world. This is 61 out of 192 countries, just under a third. And also, secondly, there is no single country in the world where the situation is reversed, right? You cannot find a country anywhere where men score more highly than women in terms of religiosity by 2 percentage points or more. Okay, this relationship is not uniform. As we've already seen, it varies from religion to religion, right? And these differences in terms of religiosity also vary in terms of the different dimensions of religiosity. Remember the 3 Bs that we've spoken about at various different points in this module. And one key finding from the research here, for instance, is that men tend to show, I've already kind of intimated this in one way, men tend to show their religiosity through external means, being seen to be praying in public, for example, and women tend to express their religiosity through internal behaviour. So men score more highly, as I said, in certain places on attendance at a place of worship, whereas women will tend to score more highly on things like prayer and being or feeling personally connected to God. Other research also shows that men and women have differing conceptions of God. Again, I'm talking in terms of the kind of population average, right? Research has found, for instance, that men are more likely to pray for individual objectives. So if men want something, they're more like, hey, God, can I have a new car? That'd be really nice. Or, I really like this new job I'm going for. Can you help me out? Like, it's kind of about getting things, right? And they're also more likely to view God as being a righteous judge. Women, on the other hand, have been found to put more emphasis on communication with God for its own sake, rather than as a sort of instrumentalist thing. And they also tend to see God as being more understanding, more forgiving, and more caring. Research has also found, which I sort of find this also really interesting, that women tend to have a greater, in societies where you have, this doesn't really work like this because we know from all the stuff on the cognitive science of religion, but in societies where you've kind of got a free choice as to which religion you go to, right? You've got a wide selection of religions to choose from. Women will tend to choose religions that are aligned with moral high gods. Remember them from all the stuff about morality, moral high gods having universal moral codes, whereas men in those societies will tend to align themselves with local gods, which don't necessarily have the same kind of universal moral aptitude. Now, there are some nuances to this, right? But nevertheless, this gender gap between male and female is a noticeable one. So how then do we try and explain this? Well, a number of theories have been put forward. I'm going to run through some of them now, but the basic answer is we don't know what causes this. Nobody knows. So if anybody's got the urge to go and do a PhD on this particular topic, you could be the one to go and, crack this particular nut. If you are interested in this gendered nature of religion issue, by the way, then the Pew report that I mentioned previously, the gender gap in religion around the world, shown on the earlier slides, one of the chapters in there, it's part 7, has a detailed review of these different theoretical approaches, right? So you can kind of get a good breakdown by having a look at that. But there are 3 main, in the literature, theories that have been put forward to explain this gender gap. One theory is that the gap is caused by biological factors. And the principal mechanism here is to do with levels of testosterone and a proclivity towards taking risks. And so the general claim here is that men generally have higher levels of testosterone than women, and that higher levels of testosterone lead people to take more risky behaviours. And so, putting this in the context of religion, the argument is that being non-religious in many societies, both, of course, historically and also, at the present time, is quite a risky thing to do because, in some places it's illegal, or you might have a sort of, run into all kinds of social and personal difficulties. Then men, because being non-religious has these high levels of costs and risks associated to it, then men, because of their greater tendency to risk-taking behaviour, are more likely to be non-religious than women. Well, it's a theory. I mean, it's not mine. I'm not presenting this as being even very good, but there you go. That's theory number one. Theory number two is that women are more religious than men because they're more caring and more nurturing than men. Whether this is due to their innate biological makeup or because of their different roles that they have in society. So the claim here is that this caring and nurturing role that women have exposes them to and gives them more responsibility for dealing with instances where people get sick, they end up suffering, greater cases of death, for example, and this leads them to be more religious. One reason for this is because, these experiences are likely to lead people to be more empathetic and more sort of spiritually minded. That's one possibility. Another argument is that because women have these kind of caring roles and this brings them into contact with suffering and death more frequently, it also brings them into contact with religious organisations more frequently, and this then plays to the arguments that we spoke about in a previous class about secularization, right? And the reasons why, the sociology of religion, the reasons why people are religious, all that stuff, if you remember, about peer groups. So if people are becoming involved with religious groups more frequently, they're more likely to be religious. Okay, well, that's argument number two. And the third theory is that women are more religious than men due to their more insecure social and economic positions. And the argument in this case is that because women tend to have less secure access to employment, they tend to have a sort of lower status in society than men, take more insecure, low-paid, lower status jobs and so on, that because of this they turn to religion as a way of dealing with this particular situation, whether it's through religious beliefs or becoming more involved with religious communities. And this is the case, by the way, even when the religion in question is arguably, as we'll see in a few minutes, part of the problem, right? If you're in a situation where religion, or the particular religion that you belong to, is sort of fairly patriarchal, maybe has, misogynistic leanings or, negative attitudes towards gender equality, let's put it that way, even in those situations, women are likely to turn to religion as a way of dealing with their social and economic disadvantages. So there's a sort of weird Stockholm syndrome thing going on here as well. But as I say, right, these are the three main theories that we have. There's bits and pieces of evidence for each of them. There are problems with all of them. Nobody really knows. So, the field is open to you to go and take up the baton and go and do some important research in this area. All of which then brings me to the second subject which I want to talk about today, which is religion and gender attitudes. And a common view here is that religion has a patriarchal orientation towards gender roles. And this is undoubtedly true in many cases, and we're going to go through some of the evidence and so on for this in just a few minutes. But I wanted to just start off, before we kind of get into that, by pointing out that there have been quite a few goddesses throughout human history, right? Sometimes you can get the impression from reading the literature that religion is sort of completely male-dominated and there's just no room for any female religious expression here at all. But there have been quite a few goddesses, and here are some examples. We have, for instance, Isis, who was the ancient Egyptian goddess of motherhood and wisdom. We've also got Gaia, the ancient Greek goddess of the earth, which if anybody's doing anything around environmental politics and climate change and so on, I'm sure you've sort of run into the Gaia hypothesis. We also have Kali, who's the Hindu goddess of time, creation, destruction, and power, so obviously quite a busy god. It's a goddess, I apologise, but lots of different things going on. Then we have Freya, who's the Nordic goddess of love and fertility and Disney songs, by the look of this particular picture. It looks like she's about to break out some sort of horrendous rendition of one of those things, one of those horrible movies. That's Freya. We also have the Morrigan, who's the Celtic goddess of, catching myself doing this, of fate, war, and death. And penultimately, we have Amaterasu, who is the Shinto goddess of the sun and the universe. And then finally, we have the creator goddess of the Navajo, who was known as the Spider Woman. So quite a lot of goddesses throughout human history, lots of different religions, lots of different roles. And there are two, I think, significant things to come out of this very quick review. One is that goddesses have played some pretty significant roles in their particular religions, right? We're talking about things like, creation, destruction, fate, death, war. These are like the big jobs, right? This isn't like, oh, you can be the goddess of cheese. I mean, I'm not saying cheese isn't important, right? Cheese is obviously vitally important, but it's not like, you're the Secretary of State for Wales or something, and you really want to be the Foreign Secretary, and it's sort of one of these, minor jobs. These are some of the biggest jobs that you can have. So that's one thing that I think is notable. And second thing, which no doubt you will be ahead of me on this already, is that these goddesses are all linked to polytheistic religions. And monotheism tends to be very highly male-centered. Now, none of this then means that religion is, of course, not patriarchal, and most goddesses, even the ones I've just shown you, still existed within patriarchal societies, right? Nordic society tended to be very patriarchal, Japanese society, very patriarchal. It's not like they had these goddesses and were living in matriarchal societies, right? In fact, full matriarchal religions are quite rare. There are some examples of this. They're very, very small, isolated examples. It's some Native American religions and some African traditions, like the Iroquois in North America or the Yoruba in Africa, for example. There are some varieties of neo-paganism that have sort of matriarchal leanings, and maybe some couple of streams within Hinduism. But as a whole, matriarchal religions are in the vast, vast minority. Most religions then, especially the traditional Abrahamic religions, have a strongly patriarchal worldview, and this is certainly the case when it comes to roles and leadership positions within those religions itself. The official stance, for example, of the Catholic Church rejects the idea of women priests and bishops. There are some reform groups that do ordain women, but these are not looked upon. They're regarded by the Vatican as being legitimate, so they're not recognised. The Anglican Communion is the Church of England, right, is more liberal. Most Anglican churches do ordain women priests, and many also, but not all, will ordain women bishops. However, more conservative churches, particularly in Africa and Asia, completely reject this idea and will only ordain men. Islamic traditions tend to be somewhere in between. Most mainstream Islamic traditions do not allow women to be imams to men, but some Islamic traditions will allow women to be imams to other women. But this is, it's a small minority, but it does tend to be sort of pitched in between this hard line of the Catholic Church and the more sort of liberal perspective of the Anglican tradition. So there's some variety within there, right? I'm making this point so you don't kind of get the impression that all religions have this completely patriarchal, rigid view, because there is some nuance, within the different approaches. So the link between religion and patriarchy, nevertheless, is pretty strong in the case of the Abrahamic faiths, and it becomes even stronger when we look at religiosity. Studies, for example, have found strong links between religiosity and traditional gender roles. So people who have higher levels of religiosity are more likely to believe that men should be the ones to go out and get jobs and earn money and have careers, right, and get educated. They should be the ones to kind of, go to university and be the dynamic one out there in public life doing all the stuff. And women should stay at home, raise children, look after the family, and be more sort of passive and docile, right? Higher levels of religiosity coincide quite strongly to this particular pattern of gender roles. And gender attitudes are also linked to the kind of God a person believes in. Now, this is research, as you can see here, by Whitehead. I think he also has done some research on the previous point I was just talking about. So if you're interested in that, then go and have a look at him. I think he's got a couple of pieces on the reading list. And research here for this particular paper found that viewing God as male was the strongest predictor of political conservatism, whereas people who viewed God as being female were more likely to take a liberal and progressive picture. Not surprisingly then, many studies have also found positive links between gender equality and non-religion. And well, as you can see here, right, there was a few quotes to sort of make this point. Research by Schnabel says that the more non-religious people you have in a country, the higher levels of gender equality you also find in that particular country. This is obviously not the exact quote, but as you can see, this is basically the gist of it. Research by Yeganay looks at religiosity at the societal level. This was a study of 73 countries and found a significant negative association between religiosity and gender equality. Research by Seguino found that religiosity was strongly correlated with gender inequitable attitudes across numerous countries. So there seems to be a link then. Societies that have high levels of religiosity tend to have lower levels of gender equality. Societies that have high levels of non-religion tend to do better on these scores. To underline this point, here is some very rough and ready, quick and dirty data of my own that I put together. This was cross-referencing data from Pew with figures from the Global Gender Gap Report, which is published by the World Economic Forum. And this is showing you the least gender equal countries in the world, right? So these are the bottom 20 countries on the list, and they're all highly religious, as you can see. The figure here that you can see is the number of people in a country, I think, who said that religion was important to them, right? Now, obviously, data, you can also see, wasn't available for all of these countries, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman are strongly religious. I think we can sort of take that as granted. So you look at these countries, least gender equality, equal countries in the world, and they are highly religious. And guess what happens when you look at the top of the list, the most gender equal countries in the world? You get a different different picture here. Just 5 of the top 20 countries in this list would be classified as being highly religious. There's no data for Namibia, but it is highly religious. New Zealand and Iceland are secularizing fairly rapidly, so non-religion is growing quite quickly there. So 75% of all the top 20 most gender equal countries in the world are not highly religious and have significant non-religious populations. So there is data to kind of support this view, right? Now, how do we explain this? Well, in one respect, it's sort of, you could say it's fairly obvious, right? And the reasons I was just talking about a couple of minutes ago, religiosity and the Abrahamic faith are strongly linked to patriarchal views. So if you have more people in a society with high levels of religiosity, that's going to have an impact on gender equality. If you have a process of secularization and the proportion of non-religious people rises, that's going to change the sort of balance within that society with attitudes towards gender, and so you're going to get more gender equal outcomes. Non-religious people, as we know, tend to be more progressive and more liberal, so this seems like a fairly, obvious and straightforward link to make. And maybe it's true, right? I'm kind of hesitating a bit here because this is the point I'm coming on to. The causal dynamics here are not necessarily as clear-cut as you might think. And so one alternative explanation here is that gender equality is not necessarily driven by non-religion. Like, gender equality is the thing that is caused by other things. It could be the other way around. It could be that non-religion is caused by gender equality. In other words, gender equality is the causal variable. And if you think back here to all the stuff we were talking about around secularization, where you have a society that modernizes and it develops and it starts to, women get access to the labour force and all of these things kick in, greater healthcare, access to reproductive rights, then you start to get higher levels of social and gender equality. And once you start to get higher levels of social and gender equality, people start to turn to religious organisations less because they have fewer existential insecurities in their life. This is the neo-secularization thesis that we were talking about earlier on. That the idea is that people turn to religion because they have existential insecurity. Well, if you're living in a society that's fairly safe and secure and has higher levels of equality, you have pretty decent levels of security, so you don't need to turn to religion. So that could be the thing that drives non-religion. So now I'm not saying which one of these is the dominant view, right? I think it's probably context dependent. There's a bit of both work. But just be aware that the causal processes in here are not necessarily as straightforward as you might think. Now, the third thing that I wanted to come on to today is the relationship between religion and sexual minorities. And the first thing to bear in mind here is that in addition to being patriarchal, many religions also have a very strong cis-normative outlook, along with a negative view towards sexual minorities. Now, just before we get into this, I want to do a sort of similar exercise again to the thing I did a few minutes ago, showing you different goddesses throughout human history, because there are quite a few examples of gods and goddesses that are homosexual and gender fluid. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm just going to show you some of them just to make the point. Various Greek gods, for example, were well known for engaging in same-sex relationships. One of the most famous examples here is Zeus and Ganymede. Ganymede was a Trojan prince who was kidnapped by Zeus in the form of an eagle, which explains why Zeus is sitting with an eagle, in case you were wondering. And we've also got Hermaphroditus, who was, of course, androgynous, a Greek goddess. Then we have Loki, who I'm sure you've all heard of. This is the trickster god from Norse mythology. Loki was gender fluid, engaged in same-sex relationships, and at one point even turned into a female so that he or she could give birth. Then we have the Aztec god, which is pronounced, I hope, Jotipedi. I think that's how you pronounce it. You won't know how to pronounce it because who speaks Aztec, right? But if you go and, I think that's how it's pronounced, Jotipedi. That's my best go anyway. And so Jotipedi is closely related to homosexuality and is sometimes depicted as having both male and female attributes. Various Hindu traditions also interpret Shiva as being androgynous or gender fluid. Hinduism has also, by the way, been fairly tolerant of transgender communities. So some Hindu scriptures talk about a third gender called the Hijra. And this is a community which contains both intersex and transgender individuals. And these people are often considered to be sacred and were legally recognized as a third gender category by the Indian government in 2014. We also have, penultimately, the Chinese rabbit god. This is a god from Chinese folk religion called Chue Shen, who is a matchmaker god for homosexual men. I just know the only thing you're going to remember from this lecture is that it was a Chinese rabbit god that sets up homosexual men for dating. Because, this is the cutest god we're going to see all day, right? And then we have, finally, Inari, who is the Shinto god of rice and fertility, who is also depicted as being male or female or androgynous. So, point being is that there are quite a lot of goddesses who are also in a position of being a sexual minority, right? And one of the things that also stands out from these examples, again, as I'm sure you've noticed, like the goddesses that I showed you earlier on, is that they're all associated with polytheistic religions. In contrast, monotheistic faiths tend to have a strongly cisnormative and binary view of sex and gender. Now, there are some cases, some instances within Sikhism, for example, where God is said to have both male and female attributes, but that's basically it, right? Monotheism, really strongly cisnormative and has a binary view of sex and gender. And the typical theological reasoning for this is that the monotheistic creation narratives claim that God made men and women separately and that sex and gender are fixed, objective facts of the world and are unchangeable. And so, partly maybe because of this, monotheistic religions also have more negative attitudes towards sexual minorities, although again, it's important to bear in mind, there is some variations between different faiths. So, for example, Catholicism, Islam, Orthodox Christianity, and Judaism have a strong view, or, well, maybe not all forms of Judaism, conservative Judaism certainly, has a strong view that sex and gender are fixed at birth and are unchangeable. Protestantism is more varied. Liberal forms of Protestantism, we talked about the Church of England earlier on, they kind of move in different directions, can be more tolerant. Evangelicals, certainly in the United States, tend to have very strong cisnormative views about things. Liberal Judaism tends to be very supportive of sexual minority rights, even allowing transgender people to become rabbis in certain situations. So, yes, monotheistic religions have this strong cisnormative view, but, just be aware that there are, again, some nuances within the different faiths. Now, religious groups who support minority rights for sexual minorities will typically argue that, because the problem is that you have a well-defined theology with creation narratives that seem to be quite explicit about the creation of male and female as different categories, right? And so what do people who support sexual minority rights from monotheistic faiths do to explain why they are supportive of these positions? Well, one argument that you can find in the literature is that people often claim that the theology needs to be updated to keep track of the latest scientific developments. As you can see here, it's a fairly lengthy quote, but I've highlighted the important section for you in red. This is from the Church of Scotland, which recently came out in support of transgender rights. There was a bill about transgender rights which was going through the Scottish Parliament, and this was one of the pieces of evidence that was submitted to it. As you can see here, the view of the Church of Scotland is, yes, the Bible takes the view that God's made male and female as separate categories, but that most Christians will take the view that pre-scientific Genesis accounts cannot override advances in the natural sciences. But supportive groups do tend to be in the minority, and like the issue of gender, religiosity and the kind of God that people believe in are also strong predictors of negative attitudes here. So people who believe in a male God, for example, are less likely to support LGBTQ rights, whereas people who believe in a female God typically will have higher levels of tolerance. And we can see some of these relationships playing out. I'm just going to give you some figures here from the United States. As you can see, this is looking at attitudes towards whether or not a person is a man or a woman, and whether or not this is fixed at birth. People who are religiously affiliated, so this is looking at the dark blue lines, are the proportions of people who say sex and gender are determined at birth. And as you can see, it's really strong, particularly in the case of white evangelical Protestants, which in 2022, 87% said that they believed that sex and gender were fixed and determined at birth. The religiously unaffiliated, as you can see here towards the bottom, much more liberal on these attitudes. The view of atheists, 76% saying that sex is not fixed at birth and that somebody's gender can be changed. One noticeable thing you might I'm going to move on quickly, so maybe you don't notice this because you're going to have to sit here and study it. These negative attitudes, as you can see, have increased over time, right? So things have actually got worse over the past sort of 8 or 9 years. And one reason for this, it seems fairly obvious to me, is the weaponization of sexual minority issues in the United States as part of this polarization of political tribes and this kind of growing culture war context that we have. And these attitudes, of course, have real-world significant consequences because they spill over into legislative actions, not just social attitudes, of course, right, in the way in which people are sort of treated on a day-to-day basis, but also legislation around sexual minorities and the rights that people have. And again, you can see here, this is showing you support for policies around transgender individuals by different religious groups. No particular surprise to find that white evangelical Protestants are the most strongly opposed to this, and the non-religious, and especially atheists, are the most supportive. So if you look, for example, the question on the left, which is saying basically, should trans people be made to use a restroom that aligns with the sex they were assigned with at birth, 68% of white evangelical Protestants were strongly in favour of this, whereas 70% of atheists strongly opposed. And we can also see this is the final set of figures I'm going to give you today. This is showing you approval for homosexuality in various countries around the world. And again, if you look at the green figures, all on the right, these are from the religiously unaffiliated. It's again sort of making the point that they tend to be more supportive of these issues than people who have high levels of religiosity. So, I wanted to try and end this lecture then. Well, I'm not going to try and end this lecture. I am actually going to do this by drawing all this together and showing you how the various links between religion, gender, and sexuality, and especially the prevalence of negative attitudes on these issues, right? On gender equality and sexual minorities, how can these things be explained by using the three main theoretical approaches that we've been using throughout this module, right? So, religious markets approach, terror management theory, and social control theory. How would those theories explain everything that we've been talking about today? So the first of these, the religious markets approach, by the way, I'm doing this partly because, I'm taking a sort of slight detour now, when you get to write your essays and, in the exam and stuff, right, you don't necessarily have to do this. Right? Don't sit there and think, oh my God, I must pick one of these three theories and then use that as the way to talk about the stuff I want to talk about, right? You don't have to do that. As we know, because you're paying attention to stuff, right? There are lots of different theoretical approaches, and some of them are specific to each particular topic. So you don't have to kind of pull one of these out of the bag, and run with it, right? Nevertheless, you can also do that, and these theoretical approaches are pretty broad, and they can be applied to pretty much most of the topics on the module. So if that was the kind of thing you wanted to do, then this might be the kind of exercise that you would go through, right? So the religious markets approach, as we know, argues that religious groups adopt particular positions, so in this case on issues of gender and sexuality, as a way of differentiating themselves within a competitive religious marketplace, right? You're competing for consumers, you have to sell your goods in a particular way, you have to position yourself, you have to have a particular brand, right? And so in issues of gender and sexuality, this, the argument goes, is what these different religious communities are doing. So some groups, for example, might offer more traditional, let's say, views on issues of gender to attract a certain demographic, while others, like the Church of Scotland, we saw a couple of minutes ago, might adopt a more liberal and progressive stance to appeal for different parts of the population, right? You might kind of look out and say, well, there is a niche part of the population there. There's a whole bunch of people who are in favour of, sexual minority rights. We'll position ourselves there, and then that will be the market that we're sort of aiming for, right? Now, doing this typically can be useful, going down the liberalisation road, for larger national level organizations because they have to appeal to the majority of people in a particular society, right? And if that society is liberalizing, and if attitudes are changing, and if things are becoming more progressive, then you need to be on the right side of that, otherwise you're going to progressively lose members. So this is, I think, why we find large-scale national organizations moving more in these directions, whereas a lot of the smaller religious groups who typically pitch up with an appeal to traditional conservative-minded people take the opposite view, that because the people who would join those groups expect to have traditional conservative religious teachings. So this is how you might explain it, I guess, through the religious markets approach. The second theory that we've been talking about is terror management theory, and this argues that people commit to a particular religion as a way of managing their existential fears around death. Now, more broadly, it's not, in the case of religion, it tends to focus on death, right? But more broadly, the terror management approach kind of pulls back a bit from that and says, well, it's really about existential angst generally, right? And the argument here then is that people adopt particular social and cultural worldviews as a way of giving them a sense of psychological security. It's a lot like the neo-secularization stuff we've talked about before. And so people like to have a particular worldview that makes them feel secure, makes them feel they've got a handle on things, kind of explains the world to them, knows where they, know where they stand, know how everything fits together. And part of this worldview construction often involves issues around gender roles and sexual norms. These form an integral part of these worldviews, and because of this, challenges to those issues, so the liberalization of sexual attitudes, can be interpreted as an existential threat to their particular worldview. And once people face a threat to their worldview, this can cause them to react in more, they basically dig themselves in, right? You kind of put the walls up, you become more rigid, and so you adopt even more negative attitudes towards people who you regard as an outgroup, because they're challenging the views that you hold, right? This is sometimes known in the literature as the worldview defense mechanism. Terror management theory says people have these worldviews, gives them a psychological map of the world. When these worldviews are challenged and threatened, they basically dig in and they try to defend their worldview in various different ways. Now, okay, this makes sense, right? I mean, it's not particularly, I'm not describing rocket science to you here. I'm sure you're all sitting there going, yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I kind of see how all that works out. But what about groups that become more liberalized? How does that work? If you have a worldview and that worldview is threatened, why do some people go down the more conservative route and some people go down a more progressive way of looking at the world? Well, one explanation in the literature here is that people who liberalize shift the nature of their worldview in such a way that it redefines what the threat is. So the more conservative people will see the threat as coming from sexual minorities, right? They're a threat to society. They're going to undermine our way of life. They're going to challenge my religion. We need to stop it, right? The threat is coming from those particular people, whereas others may say the real threat here to my worldview and my sense of psychological security isn't the actual sexual minority groups, right? It's the issue of social equality. Because if we allow a situation to develop where people are treated differently and sexual minorities don't have rights, and we have these wedge issues to drive people apart, and we have political polarization, and we have culture wars, then that is actually going to be worse psychologically and in terms of existential security. That's the real threat that my worldview faces. So therefore, to accommodate that, I'm going to adopt a more liberal position that focuses on issues of social equality and the rights of sexual minorities as a way of dealing with that challenge. And this is sometimes called in the literature an adaptive worldview response. Now, it seems to me on the face of it, this is a slightly circular argument, right? Because I'm not quite sure how you've explained much here, right? If one person becomes more conservative, you go, oh, yeah, it's because they're reacting in this particular way. If somebody adopts a more liberal approach, you go, yeah, it's because they're reacting in this particular way, but you haven't actually damaged the framework of terror management theory, right? So it's a little bit kind of all-encompassing. And maybe that's a problem. I don't know. We can talk about that in seminars maybe. But this is how the terror management approach would look at these issues, right? And then finally, we have social control theory. And this, as we know, argues that religious groups try to exert control over their members as a way of extending their power and authority, both in relation to the group as well as society more widely. And so from this view, and again, this isn't rocket science, right? Enforcing patriarchal, cis-normative codes of behaviour can be seen as an effective way for a group to assert control over people because, issues of gender and sexuality are central to who we are as human beings. These are central to how we live our lives. These are central to our sense of identity. And so if you can control people, how they see themselves that way and how they see others, you can control how they behave, you can control how they react in different situations, and you can kind of bring them into the orbit of your particular religious community. This would be the social control theory approach. And so this is similar in some respects to the terror management theory, because both of them focus on the symbolic boundary that the religious community puts in place between itself and the rest of the world, right? Sexual minorities are on the other side of this symbolic boundary. We have norms and values and things that our religious community believes in and ways that we should behave and ways in which we relate to the world, and we kind of draw this boundary around ourselves, and then everything else is on the other side of that. So terror management theory does that as a way of constructing a psychological worldview for people. Social control theory says religious groups do that as a way of maintaining power and authority over people. And so this is, again, particularly useful in the case of a perceived threat, or even if sexual minorities are not a particular threat to your religion. You can present them as a threat to your religion because you can then activate that symbolic boundary, and that will cause people to become more closely bound to your particular religious worldview. And so, like terror management theory, you've also kind of got, this explains why religious communities may have strongly conservative and traditional attitudes, right? Oh, it's about social control, right? Why don't you have women's rights? It's about social control. Why don't you like to have gay rights? It's about social control. Okay, that's all pretty straightforward to understand. But again, like with terror management theory, you've got the same problem, but like what happens when groups liberalise? How do you explain the Church of Scotland? How are they engaging in social control theory by moving away from their initial position and starting to become more liberal and progressive on these issues, right? Well, social control theory, similar to the point I was making a few minutes ago about national groups having to appeal to a wide number of people. Well, again, you've got a similar problem, right? If you're a national level organisation like the Church of Scotland, and the population of the country that you represent or claim to represent are becoming more progressive, then it makes sense from a certain demographic point of view to move in that direction. Otherwise, from a social control perspective, you are going to have fewer people to exert influence and control over because they will just abandon your religion because they won't like the kind of theology that you're serving up. So this would be how you could approach it from these different theoretical approaches. I'm not saying any of these would be the example to follow on this topic, but I'm just giving you an idea of how these different theoretical lenses could be applied to this particular subject. And that, slightly ahead of time by about 100 seconds, I think, is it for today. So next week, I'm going to be talking about religion, human rights, and the law. But for today, that's it. As usual, thanks for coming, and I will see you all next time.